Hello everyone, my name's Martin Walker. I'm a partner in the consulting business, PA Consulting, and I'm going to talk to you today about data catalogues, the why, the what and the how. So let's take a start. So first of all, I'll describe to you what is a data catalogue, then talk about why you may need a data catalogue, and then talk about some of the lessons that I've experienced about how to get the implementation right, and then tell you a bit about who's playing in what space. So why do you need a data catalogue? Well, the starting point is you need to, typical exam question is, what is our data? Where is our data and how is our data being processed? So if I'm a data scientist, I want to know whereabouts can I find the loans data in the bank, or whereabouts can I find the hydroelectric data from the hydroelectric station. I want to know about whereabouts is the data. So is it in the Hadoop system? Is it in a transactional system? And I want to know about how the data is being processed. If I'm the data protection officer, how do we know that we're processing the personal data according to the consent that's been given by the private individuals? It's also really important to understand who's using the data. So again, if you're a data producer, you own that data and you need to make sure that it is being controlled. So who are the people who are dependent upon your data for their business processes? And then there's another question around, what about the quality of the data? Is this data that I'm allowed to use for finance reporting? Or is this data that I can use for to be able to drive marketing campaigns? Or is it data that I can give me a high level picture about what the business is looking like? So there's a lot of questions around what is the appropriate quality and what can that data actually be used for? And then as we get into more and more of the legal side of things, there are policies around that describe what we're allowed to do with the data. How do I go and find about all those policies that are relevant for me as either a consumer of data, what am I allowed to do with it, or a producer of data around what standards do I need to adhere to? So the purpose of the data catalogue is to provide a centralised place where you can go and get a lot of those answers for both the consumers and the producers of data and the compliance teams. So the analogy that I try to use to think about, well, what is a data catalogue? Well, think about a traditional catalogue. We had our good old IKEA type catalogue that you go into a store and you pick something up and you look, there'll be an index that's sectioned by homeware or by kitchens or by whatever other kind of sections we have there. And against that, you can go and you can read about a product and you'll find critical information about that product. So you may find where to find it in the store. You may find a description of it. You may find about a price. And that's what our data catalogue is there for. So I can go and look for data, or I can go and look for a data set, and it will describe the data set. It will describe the quality of the data. It will describe who is the owner of the data. And I've sort of distinguished between version 1 and version 2, because as you move towards version 2, which is more the online view, that's when it becomes a lot more dynamic. And that's where you can start understanding, well, what are the stock levels associated with a particular product? I can go in there and physically order a product from your catalogue. And that's where we're seeing the data catalogues are going, from being more of a static view as to how people think the data landscape looks like, through to a far more dynamic view that's been updated all time and being really connected to your infrastructure. So when we talk about a catalogue of enterprise assets, what do we mean by assets? Well, an asset could be a report, a BI report. It could be an API. It could be a table. It could be a database. So it's you as a bank or an organization identifying what are those data assets that you need to be able to manage and track, and you need to be in control of. And those are the assets that you're going to put into your catalogue and you're going to describe in a way that is meaningful for your business and for your consumers of data. So the data catalogue will be used by a number of different stakeholders across the organisation. You may start off with it being, depending on your use case, you may start off it as being a tool that is used by the data scientists. As and when they load new data into the data lake, they want to know what that data is. They want to catalog it so they can share that information amongst themselves and say, I know over here we've got our loan transactions, and I know over here we've got our social data. And you catalog it in a way that when the second data scientist comes along, they can find the data. They understand what the different fields mean. They understand what they're allowed to do with it. And they're able to continually get the most from the data. And the value add there is, rather than searching around the organization to try and find the data, they know exactly where to find something. The second group that are really driving the use of this is compliance, certainly in banking, and the data protection officer. So for GDPR, you need a catalogue of processing activities. So understanding what data is used in what process, and making sure that the different teams who use that data and manage that data are actually using it and managing it according to the standards set and according to the laws of the land. And then you've got the chief data officer certainly in many organizations is becoming responsible for being able to explain to the organization, what data do we have? Where is it? How is it being used? How do we make sure that we have golden sources of data or authoritative sources of data? So the chief data officer and their team are taking more and more responsibility for ensuring that we've got definitions correctly identified for your data and mapping that to where the data actually is. So the CDO and their team are increasingly using data catalogs more and more. And then certainly in the banking world, we have regulations such as BCBS 239, and there are a whole load of other regulations around making sure that we understand the lineage and the content of data that feed into our risk models. So when we start calculating the cost of capital, we understand that we've got all of the correct sets of data. How do you do that and understand what data originates from where? Where's the data processed? And how do I know I have a complete set of data to make accurate calculations? So you'll find that compliance are equally interested in seeing the catalogue to understand the record of processing activities and where all that data sits. So there's a whole number of consumers there that have got a real interest in the data catalogue. And it all really depends on your use case as to who the primary ones are for you and your organisation. So let's just take a step back and say, well, this all sounds fairly straightforward so far, but you've got to put it in the context of the data landscape is horrendously complicated. Think about it as far as we all talk about, we have a spaghetti architecture where there are systems all over the place and we have data that's flowing between these systems. The data could be flowing because you have batch end of day routines where data is being sent. We have APIs which are being queried on an ongoing basis. We've got a number of different ways that data is moving around the landscape. The second thing is we've got the landscape is changing all the time. If you look at, we have DevOps, where teams are releasing software on an ongoing basis. Every time software is released, there's often a change to the data model. So how do you maintain the view of the data landscape and keep that up to date? And coupled with that, data is not already described in a particularly good way. So it's the analogy I often use is you walk into a library and you find all of the library books strewn all over the floor, and you need to start organising it in some way. Where do you start? Do you start going into each individual page of each individual book and starting looking at the words? Or do you start with some high-level categorisation and start trying to come up with a system for managing it? That's what you need to think about with your data catalogue, is how are we going to organise our data? What is the critical data that we need to organise? I think the other thing that's really important is recognising that just because you've got a field name that says we've got a loans table, it doesn't mean that it's only loans in that table. Different people will use systems for their purpose, and they may not always use them the way they're intended to be used. So I had a great story about Ayrton Senna, the motor racing driver. He was actually insured by a shipping company. So when he died, his the data entry was describing the sinking of a ship. And there's no way from looking at a set of metadata and looking at table names, you'd know that Ayrton Senna's details were in that particular table or within that system. So you really need to understand the actual data. You can't just rely on data structures, which many catalogs and many solutions point you towards. So key message here, the data landscape is highly complex. There's thousands and thousands or millions and millions of pieces of data out there, and you need to pick your battles and understand what do you really need to catalog? What's the critical data that needs to be cataloged? So what are the key capabilities that you need to have in a data catalog? And out there are many different catalog types. So this doesn't mean that you're going to end up with just a single catalog. You may have a number of different cataloging type applications. But the fundamentals are, you need a common database where the catalog information is going to be stored. And the critical thing in that database, it's all about relating assets to one another. So you need to be able to describe your business terms, how they relate to one another. You identify what you need to describe about your data, and you need to capture information about the data itself and relate it to one another. So as an example, I may want to know about the information security classification of a piece of data. So I need to be able to relate our valid security classifications to the data assets. It should be organized around communities because you cannot centralize a data catalog. You need to make sure that this is a federated activities where the people who are closest to the data, who are working with the data, are the ones who maintain the catalog for their content. Ideally, we want to make sure that we need to make sure that we've got the operating model where they have the ability to update their data assets in the catalog. So the key thing is making sure it's federated and you have process for maintaining the catalog. In order to maintain the catalog, again, you don't want people having to key in everything manually. You need to make sure that you've got an open solution with open APIs, and you need to make sure that you've got agents that are out there that are able to automate some of the capture of that data. So make sure that any catalog you look at, it is very able to integrate with the outside world, and that you have some different agents that can support multiple data formats and bringing that data into the catalog. You also need to look at saying, how do we actually manage all of those relationships? How do I identify when something has changed? And some of the earlier generation catalogs were very much rules driven. So if something happens, do this. The newer types are using a lot more AI in order to identify patterns in the data, to identify anomalies, and populating the catalog with the information that is discovered. Again, work out when is the right place to use manual intervention versus when is the right place to use AI and other machine learning techniques. You also need to make sure that you've got dashboards, reports, and visualization tools. Again, a lot of the information in the catalog is about relationship. So you need to be able to visualize the relationships between the data. It's really important that you have a tool that users are able to effectively use. The number of catalog tools that I've seen out there that business users have turned around and said, I cannot work with this. It is too difficult to understand. So you need to look at the reporting capability and the analytical capability that the catalog has. So now let's talk about some of the challenges when implementing a data catalog. So what are the things you need to think about? The starting point is, what data do you need to get into your catalog? You've got to be business driven. You've got to think about the use case and the problems you're trying to solve. If you start with a blanket approach that says, let's just go and hoover up all of our stored procedures, all of our data warehouses and all of the logic in there, you're just going to get a big mash of understandable mess. So you've really got to focus on what are the use cases. And within that, that's saying, well, what are those different types of data assets that we want to manage at an enterprise level? So think about whether are they the reports? Is it critical tables in the data lake or critical data assets in the data lake? Is it your warehouses? What level of detail do you need to get to be able to really add value? So do you really need to understand every single transformation and try and catalog it? Or is it sufficient to understand what are the main data sets and who's responsible for it. And you can go and talk to them and they can tell you exactly how the stored procedures or how the code works. You also need to think about actual data versus metadata. I mentioned earlier about data structures. The metadata can tell you about the data structures, but it doesn't tell you about the actual data. So if I am sitting in the front office in a bank and I create a new product and I go and add a new, that's essentially adding new data to a system. I'm not making any physical changes to the technology itself. If you just look at metadata, you would never know about the existence of that new product. So you need to think about what is the actual data and where do we need actual data in our catalog, such as this product is processed in this system, this product is processed in this system. That typically won't be delivered to you by the metadata. You need to be looking and reading data to understand how that changes. The second area is how will you populate and maintain your catalog? Again, it's very easy to shoot for the stars and say we want to have everything in our catalog. But you need to start thinking about where can automation be used. So where can we go and use business rules or AI or APIs in order to suck data into the catalog? How can we use business rules, AI and automation in order to validate the data in the catalog? So where are there opportunities to use automation versus manual? When talking about manual effort, you need to think about what level of manual effort is sustainable. I've seen too many catalogs being implemented where organizations will come up and literally say everything has to be keyed in manually. And it's just not sustainable and the whole thing falls down flat. You can see projects where armies of consultants are sent in to fill spreadsheets in of people's views. The problem with that is the quality is usually low because people think they know things, but the facts are different. And it's also highly inefficient to maintain. It's out of date before the exercise is finished. Thirdly, you need to think about how do you integrate your data catalog into your software development lifecycle. So the best thing we can do is, as and when we define new business terms or as and when we define new business rules, work out where are we capturing the requirements for that? How do we get those requirements feeding into our catalog? As and when we're deploying new tables into the infrastructure, how can we make sure any new tables or any new artifacts are automatically catalogued? So feed it into the development process rather than trying to do a big after the event capture of the data. You also need to think about how do you maintain high quality data in your catalog, because nothing can be more frustrating than people go in and look for something and once they found it, they found that what they found was either incorrect or they just couldn't find what they were looking for. So what's your techniques going to be used for keeping the quality of the catalog up to date? Some will be using governance, some will be using technology. And what are the processes for adding new data assets? So work through it using a combination of automation and manual input. How are you going to get new producers and owners of data to add new content to the catalog? And then finally, what will be your data catalog operating model? These things don't just survive on their own. So you're going to need to have a central team that are able to manage the catalog product, and you're going to have these federated teams who are out there maintaining the data in the catalog. You need to be thinking about, is this going to be a single catalog or multiple catalogs? Many of the catalogs out there are focused around metadata, but a critical part is viewing that real-time flow of data. There are different vendors out there that are able to support the flow of actual data. There are some catalogs that have been designed to support data privacy. There are some that have been designed very much platform-centric. So how many of these catalogs do you actually need? And then you need to think about the data governance experts and the people who are actually going to be supporting the consumers. And you need to think about the actual development effort. It's an application at the end of it, so it needs dev and config effort. So how do you break down the implementation? So the starting point is you need to start by thinking big, start small. So you don't want to block yourself off on day one by just going for the first use case. You need to think about what is the objective. You need to get leadership aligned. This is going to be an organization-wide effort required to maintain it. So if you just focus on a few key people, then you're probably not going to make it. You need to be thinking about who in the organization needs to be aligned in order to make this work. So this is going to be the people who work with data, whether that be on the IT side or on the consumption side or the production side. You need to start identifying some value-driven use cases. You need to think about get the priority between the complexity to implement and the value that you can get out of it. And start small. Start thinking about what are some of those priority use cases and how do we come up with our first initial use case to work on. And then you need to think about the capability development. There's the capabilities of the core team that are going to maintain the catalog, but you also need to think about how do you raise the knowledge and the capability out in the business areas and out in the federated organization for all of those people who are going to be able to work with the catalog. So you start small and then you scale fast. So that's about making sure you've got the right governance and the behaviors in place. What is acceptable? Do you need to have a policy in place to help drive this through? How are you going to measure the success of this and hold business leaders responsible for ensuring their teams populate the catalogue appropriately and maintain it? You need to make sure that you're productionizing the solutions. It's no good having this thing in sort of pilot for the next umpteen years. You need to make sure that you're able to production and show some real value. And then you need to start making sure that you can sustain and build those capabilities. So build on the strengths and make sure your central team is working well and those federated teams are working well. So hopefully that's now given you sort of an overview as to what it is and how you're successful in your implementation. Now just a few words on the actual market. Data catalogs are complex in the sense of Gartner sort of described them about 4 or 5 years ago, and many different vendors have jumped on the sort of the data catalog bandwagon. And so they've come from a number of different areas and they are converging, but there are still a number of different tools out there. So you've got tools that have been designed for the CDO. So the typical tools there would be Calibra and Informatica's Axon product. So they're very much designed for the business user to be able to govern data. You've then got teams for kind of tools for operations teams. So these are more the tools that you would give to the people who are actually physically loading data into systems. And there you've got, again, Informatica have got a tool. They've got their enterprise data catalog, and you've got IBM, have got IGC, and there are a number of other tools that have been designed really for the operations teams. There are a number of tools that have been integrated into data management products. So I've already mentioned Informatica. They have their tool of data management products that's very closely coupled to PowerCenter. You've got IBM's suite of tools, which includes IGC. You've got Ab Initio, they have a data catalog. So there's a number of different tools that are integrated and part of those integrated data management tool sets. Then there've been a number of sort of new tools that have been focused around the data lake. So Waterline would be one example where as you bring data into data lake, you're able to catalog it. So very much solution specific. And then finally, you've got tools for the data protection officer. So there's a number around cataloging processes and data. So you've got Big ID, for example, would be one example. So it's a complex landscape out there. There are many different stakeholders, and there are tools that have been focused to attract those different stakeholders' requirements. You need to be thinking really, what is your use case? What is your enterprise need for a catalog? And that will then direct you towards which one of these types of tools you want to be looking at. And that is it. Thank you very much.